What happens when a black man walks into a bank and is treated like a criminal? Who is he? Follow the story of a black man as he faces shocking acts of racism at a major bank. Can a moment of injustice create real change? This is H2 Black Thread. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more inspiring stories. Marcus Hayes had been to Manhattan countless times, but today felt different. As the CEO of a successful financial conglomerate, he wasn't used to simply being a customer anymore. He rarely had the chance to experience the world through the lens of an average person. But today, he needed to make a simple withdrawal, something that, ironically, would serve as a painful reminder of the biases that still followed him. It was a cool morning in mid-November, the city bustling with its usual energy. The towering skyscrapers of Manhattan loomed overhead, casting long shadows over the crowded streets. Marcus, however, was walking with a sense of purpose, yet there was an unexpected sense of freedom. He had chosen to dress casually for the visit, donning an old, faded hoodie, sneakers, and sunglasses that hid his identity. His appearance was far from the polished look people typically associated with him. It was deliberate. Entering the bank's glass doors, the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh paper greeted him. The room was filled with the usual hum of activity, employees typing away, soft chatter between customers, the sound of phones ringing in the distance. But as soon as Marcus stepped in, he felt the subtle shift in energy. He could feel eyes on him. The bank was quiet, but something in the atmosphere had changed. The employees, already behind their counters, paused in their actions. Customers in line exchanged glances, some eyeing him cautiously, others quickly averting their gaze. It wasn't a hostile feeling, but it was palpable. Marcus had learned over the years that people often reacted this way when they saw him, particularly in a setting like this. The energy was no longer neutral. Marcus had been in this branch countless times before, but today was different. Today, he was just another man walking into the bank, dressed in casual clothes and to some, looking like he didn't belong. It wasn't the first time he had been judged by his appearance. It was a reality he had dealt with since his early days growing up in a tough neighborhood. But now, despite his accomplishments and success, it still haunted him. He approached the counter where a young man in his 20s stood behind the glass. His name tag read, Todd. The teller's neat appearance, tidy hair, pressed shirt, professional posture, seemed at odds with the look of skepticism he now gave Marcus. Todd glanced up from his computer screen, his eyes scanning Marcus up and down as if trying to place him. Marcus smiled faintly, trying to shake off the feeling that something was about to go wrong. "I'd like to withdraw $10,000, he said, keeping his tone casual but firm. Todd looked up, his brow furrowing as he quickly looked back at Marcus. "Are you sure you have an account here?" he asked, his voice full of uncertainty. The word stung, more than Marcus cared to admit. It wasn't a question anyone had ever asked him before, not in this particular way. Sure, people had been skeptical when he started out, when he didn't look like someone who belonged in the circles he was now part of. But now, he had built his empire. His name was well known in the business world, and his financial institution was one of the most powerful in the country. And yet, here he was being questioned, doubted, simply because of his appearance. He stared at Todd for a moment, weighing his options. He could call out the subtle prejudice right then and there, but he didn't want to give the teller the satisfaction of seeing him flustered. Instead, he remained calm, leaning forward slightly, the smile on his lips barely noticeable now. "I'm sure," Marcus replied. Todd hesitated. His fingers tapped on the keyboard and his eyes darted between the screen and Marcus's ID. It wasn't like Marcus had anything to prove. But something about the way Todd looked at him made him feel like he was being treated differently from everyone else in the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't get angry, but the feeling that someone doubted his worth, again, was one he knew all too well. It never got easier. After a long moment, Todd glanced back at Marcus. "I'll need to see your ID and account information," he said, his voice sounding even more uncertain now. Marcus opened his wallet and slid both his bank card and driver's license across the counter. Todd took the card and began flipping it between his fingers as if inspecting it, not with the precision of a banker but with a vague air of suspicion. Marcus watched, his patience wearing thin as Todd continued to examine the card slowly, almost as though he were expecting to find something wrong. "Is there an issue?" Marcus asked, his voice level but with a trace of irritation now. Todd finally stopped inspecting the card and began typing into his computer, his movements slow and deliberate. Marcus could feel the tension mounting in the air as the teller's reluctance became more and more evident. It wasn't just the withdrawal that was in question, it was Marcus's very right to take out his own money. The more Marcus thought about it, the more frustrated he became. "Sorry, we can't do that," Todd said, pushing the card and ID back toward Marcus. Marcus blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean, I have the funds?" he said, the confusion evident in his voice. Todd's tone was now even more dismissive. "We don't keep that much cash on hand," he said nonchalantly. "You'd need to request it ahead of time." Marcus's eyebrows furrowed. It was clear now that this wasn't about the bank's procedures. This was about something else, something unspoken but all too clear. Todd wasn't just denying the request based on technicalities. There was a deeper implication in his words, something that cut to the core of the prejudice Marcus had encountered his entire life. "Are you suggesting my money isn't legitimate?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but a coldness underlying every word. Todd leaned back, almost smirking, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was causing. "I'm just saying that we have rules," he replied, still not quite grasping the situation. Marcus inhaled deeply, forcing himself to remain calm. This wasn't just about a simple transaction anymore. This was about making sure that no one ever had to face this kind of treatment again, no matter who they were or what they had accomplished. "Check again," Marcus said quietly, his voice laced with authority. Todd hesitated but reluctantly typed again. His fingers moved slower now, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of Marcus's gaze. After a few moments, Todd's face changed. He looked at the screen, then at Marcus, and his eyes widened slightly. He swallowed hard and with a sigh glanced up at Marcus. "Ah," Todd said, his voice faltering. "There's a note on your account. It says large withdrawals require management approval." Marcus's patience had completely run out. He leaned in closer, his voice low but unyielding. "You didn't check that before denying me, did you?" Todd opened his mouth to speak, but then thought better of it. His eyes shifted uncomfortably as he realized his mistake. Marcus stood tall, staring him down. He was done playing games. Today was about more than just withdrawing money. It was about standing up for his dignity. The air in the bank seemed to grow heavier, as though the room had suddenly shifted, and Marcus could feel every eye in the space now focused squarely on him. His heart rate remained steady, his demeanor calm, but internally, something had shifted. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. It was no longer about the money. It was about something deeper, something he had been fighting against for years, the assumption that someone like him, someone who looked like him, didn't belong in this space. Todd, still holding Marcus's ID and bank card, stared down at the screen in front of him, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as if searching for an excuse to prolong the interaction. The young teller's actions were deliberate, each keystroke slow and methodical. Marcus had learned to read people over the years, and Todd's hesitance, the way he seemed to examine the account balance, was no accident. It was as if Todd had already made a judgment about Marcus, one that went beyond the account details in front of him. For a moment, Marcus stood silently, watching the exchange unfold before him. His mind raced through all the possible reasons for the delay. Had there been a mistake in his account? Had something gone wrong with the transaction? He wasn't worried about the money. He was concerned with the way he was being treated. The message was clear. His appearance, his clothes, and the way people perceived him had placed him into a category that didn't belong in the same space as these bankers. Finally, Todd looked back at him, a slight frown on his face, his lips pursed in a way that indicated dissatisfaction. Without lifting his gaze, Todd muttered, "We can't do that." The words came out quickly, almost as if he had rehearsed them, as if he were expecting them to be the next line in the script. Marcus felt a rush of frustration, but he kept it in check. "What do you mean?" he asked, keeping his tone steady. "I have the funds. My account balance is more than enough for this transaction." Todd glanced back at the screen, his fingers tapping idly on the edge of the counter. "We don't have that much cash on hand," he said, his voice still casual, almost dismissive. "You'd need to request it ahead of time." Marcus's eyebrows knitted together, and his gaze locked on Todd's. "That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking why you're delaying this. I've done this transaction 100 times before." Todd met his gaze briefly before looking away, his eyes scanning the screen again as if the answer was buried somewhere in the computer. "It's just protocol," Todd said, his tone now slightly defensive. "Protocol," Marcus repeated, his voice low and controlled, though the frustration simmered just beneath the surface. "You're telling me that your protocol requires me to prove the legitimacy of my funds?" Todd gave a small shrug. "It's not personal. It's just how things work here. We need to verify the source of the funds." His eyes met Marcus's briefly before quickly darting away again. The statement wasn't just about procedure. It was about something deeper, a subtle implication that Marcus's money wasn't legitimate or that somehow he hadn't earned it. The truth hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. It wasn't the first time he had encountered this kind of subtle discrimination, but it never ceased to frustrate him. The way people would look at him, the way his wealth and success were always questioned, just because of the color of his skin. It wasn't just about the money. It was about how the world still saw him. No matter how far he had come, no matter how much he had achieved, there would always be someone who would doubt his place in a world where wealth and power were often reserved for others. For a moment, Marcus just stood there, his mind racing. He could feel the eyes of the customers behind him, the silent judgment of the employees who were now aware of the tension. The bank was quiet, but the silence spoke volumes. He could sense the growing discomfort in the room. Everyone was watching now. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to give Todd the satisfaction of seeing him lose his composure. But this wasn't just about a minor inconvenience. It was about his dignity, his worth, and the constant battle against the stereotypes that followed him. No matter how much he had earned or accomplished, there would always be people who saw him as less than. But Marcus was done letting people push him around. "Listen," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm, "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to take out my money just like anyone else would, but it seems like you have some personal issues that need to be addressed." Todd looked at him blankly, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice defensive. "I mean," Marcus continued, his voice growing slightly colder, "I want to speak to your manager." "Right now." Todd's face faltered for a moment, his eyes darting back to the computer screen. I can't." "No," Marcus interjected, his tone now sharp and unyielding. "You will. You're not going to get away with this. I've been more than patient with you, and I'm done being disrespected." Todd hesitated, his fingers frozen above the keyboard. He clearly didn't want to escalate the situation, but Marcus wasn't going to let this slide. This wasn't just a small mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a blatant act of discrimination, and Marcus wasn't about to let it go. "I'll call the manager," Todd muttered reluctantly, pressing a button under the counter. Within seconds, a calm voice crackled through the speaker on the desk, confirming that the branch manager would be right over. Marcus stood tall, his jaw clenched as he waited for the manager. The entire bank seemed to hold its breath, the tension rising in the air. He could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on him, and although he was used to being in the spotlight, this felt different. This wasn't about him being the CEO of a billion-dollar company. This was about his worth being questioned in a way that had nothing to do with his success and everything to do with how others saw him. When the manager, a middle-aged man with a neatly pressed suit and a warm smile, entered the scene, Marcus was ready. He wasn't going to let Todd's behavior slide, and he wasn't going to let anyone else in that bank think that this was just some random incident. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a much larger problem that still existed, one that Marcus had been fighting his entire life. "I need to speak with you," Marcus said, his voice firm but composed as he turned to face the manager. The manager smiled politely, but the smile quickly faded when he saw the tension in the air. He turned to Todd, who was standing nervously behind the counter, avoiding eye contact. Marcus took a deep breath, holding his ground. "I was just denied access to my own money," he said, his words measured but laced with the weight of everything he had just experienced. The manager's eyes widened as he processed the situation. He looked between Marcus and Todd, his face flushing as the reality of what had just happened sank in. This wasn't just an error, it was a clear case of racial bias, and it had just been carried out in front of everyone in the bank. "I'm so sorry, sir," the manager said quickly, his voice tinged with embarrassment. "This is completely unacceptable." Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "I hope you're not just sorry because I'm making a scene," he said quietly. "I hope you're actually sorry because this never should have happened in the first place." Todd stood there, his face flushed red with shame as the manager turned his attention back to him. It was clear that Todd had made a critical mistake, but Marcus wasn't going to let that mistake slide without consequences. This wasn't just about money, it was about respect. "I expect this to be addressed immediately," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "And I expect this kind of behavior to be rooted out of this bank." With that, the manager nodded quickly, promising to handle the situation and ensure that such discrimination would never happen again. Todd didn't speak, his eyes downcast as he stood in silence. As Marcus left the counter, he could feel the eyes of the customers and employees still following him, but this time he walked out with his head held high. He had done what needed to be done. This wasn't about the money. It was about standing up for himself, for every person who had ever been unfairly judged, and for the simple idea that respect was something everyone deserved. The moment the office door swung open, the soft clink of the bell overhead reverberated throughout the bank. Ethan Caldwell, the regional manager, stepped into the main area, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. As his eyes scanned the room, they immediately locked onto Marcus Hayes. A fleeting moment of uncertainty crossed Ethan's face, his steps slowing as he processed the situation. But the recognition was instantaneous, and within a heartbeat, everything about Ethan's demeanor changed. Ethan had worked in this branch for years, managing countless transactions, overseeing the day-to-day operations of one of the most important financial hubs in the city. He was used to interacting with clients, making deals, and resolving conflicts, but this was different. Marcus Hayes, the man standing before him, was not just any client. Marcus wasn't a regular customer. He was the owner of this very institution, the man whose name was attached to the wealth and success of the entire bank chain. For a brief moment, Ethan stood frozen. He blinked twice, his mind processing the sight of Marcus standing at the counter in front of Todd, the young teller. The warm, friendly smile that had once defined his customer service persona now seemed out of place as his brain began to comprehend the gravity of the mistake Todd had made. The realization that Marcus was the CEO, the owner of the entire bank, the very man who had the authority to make the decisions he only dreamed of, hit Ethan like a tidal wave. His usual professionalism faltered, and the comfortable, well-practiced facade he had maintained for years melted away. As Marcus turned slightly, his presence commanding attention, Ethan straightened his posture, trying to regain some composure. His thoughts raced as he quickly assessed the situation. Was he supposed to apologize? How was this going to play out? What consequences would Todd face? But all these thoughts crashed to a halt the moment he locked eyes with Marcus. There was no escaping the truth. He had made a mistake, a colossal one. Todd, standing behind the counter, was caught completely off guard. His face drained of color, and his hand, which had been hovering over the keyboard just moments earlier, froze. His eyes darted nervously between Marcus and Ethan, his body betraying the shock that ran through him like a jolt of electricity. The confidence that had been oozing from Todd just moments before now evaporated completely, leaving behind an awkward and tense silence. He had made an assumption, one that would haunt him for a long time to come. In that single moment, Todd's world shrank to nothing. He had not just made an error in judgment, he had fundamentally miscalculated who he was standing in front of. Marcus Hayes, a man who had built a financial empire from the ground up, was not just a client. He was the driving force behind everything that had made this bank thrive. And yet, Todd had treated him as though he were an imposter, unworthy of basic respect. The shame was evident in his face, and no amount of words could undo the damage done in that moment. Ethan took a deep breath, his face now pale, his heart racing. He could feel the weight of the room shift, the collective awareness of the employees and customers gradually sinking in. They all knew what had just happened. The silence that followed was deafening, stretching on for what felt like an eternity. The hum of the bank's usual activity seemed to fade away as the realization spread throughout the room. The owner of the bank had just been mistreated by one of their own employees. It was an undeniable, humiliating truth. Marcus stood perfectly still, watching the scene unfold. His posture remained calm, his gaze unwavering as Ethan hurriedly made his way across the room toward him. He could sense the growing tension around him, the eyes of the employees, the whispers from the customers, all of them waiting for something to happen, some kind of resolution. What they didn't realize, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that Marcus had already made his decision. He wasn't going to let this slide. He wasn't going to let Todd's ignorance go unchecked. This wasn't just about his withdrawal, it was about something far bigger. This was about dignity, respect, and accountability. As Ethan reached him, his face now flushed with embarrassment, he extended a shaky hand toward Marcus. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice unsteady, I wasn't aware you were here today." There was no mistaking the nervousness in his tone. Marcus didn't immediately respond. Instead, he looked Ethan up and down, gauging his reaction. He could see the man was rattled, and he couldn't help but notice the slight quiver in his hand as he extended it toward him. Ethan was clearly trying to regain control of the situation, but it was obvious he was failing. The tension was too thick, the weight of his mistake too heavy to ignore. "No," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a calm authority. "I don't think you were aware of a lot of things today, Ethan." He stepped forward slightly, his gaze never leaving the manager's. "And I don't think you were aware that your employee, Todd, just denied me access to my own money." His voice, while calm, cut through the air like a knife. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of fact. Ethan visibly flinched at Marcus's words, his face blanching further. His eyes flickered nervously toward Todd, who was now standing stock still, his head down and his hands trembling at his sides. Ethan seemed to consider what to do next, his mind racing to find a way to fix the situation, but there was no easy solution to this. There was no undoing what had happened, no quick way to smooth over the damage. "I assure you," Ethan began, his voice shaking, "this is not how we conduct business. This is completely unacceptable." He turned quickly to Todd, who still stood motionless behind the counter, his face pale with shame. "Todd," Ethan said, his voice sharp, "what you've done here today is inexcusable. This isn't just an error. It's a violation of basic customer service protocol. I expect a full report on this situation, and I will be taking immediate action." Todd, his face flushed with humiliation, opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His lips trembled and his eyes remained fixed on the floor. He was caught, trapped in the consequences of his own actions. Marcus didn't look at Todd. Instead, he focused on Ethan, his tone unwavering. "I don't want an apology, Ethan. I don't want excuses. I want accountability. And I expect this kind of behavior to be rooted out of this bank. Immediately." Ethan nodded rapidly, his head bobbing in agreement, but it was clear that he didn't fully understand the depth of Marcus's request. This wasn't just about Todd's mistake. This wasn't just about a simple apology. This was about something more profound, the need for the bank to recognize the systemic issue of discrimination that still lingered in its walls, often unnoticed but deeply ingrained in its everyday operations. "Understood," Ethan muttered, his voice barely audible. "We'll address this. You have my word." He didn't meet Marcus's eyes as he spoke, his gaze dropping to the floor in an attempt to avoid the intensity of the moment. Marcus didn't reply immediately. Instead, he let the silence settle between them, allowing the weight of the words to sink in. The room remained still, the tension suffocating as the employees and customers stood by, all too aware that something monumental had just transpired. Marcus finally turned away from Ethan and walked toward the counter where Todd stood. He didn't look back at Ethan, didn't need to. He knew Ethan was scrambling to figure out what to do, but it didn't matter anymore. The damage had been done, and it couldn't be undone by a few empty words or an apology. As Marcus reached the counter, he turned back to face the room. "This isn't about the money," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "It's about respect. It's about the principle that every person, regardless of their appearance or background, deserves to be treated with dignity." With that, Marcus turned and walked out of the bank, leaving behind a room full of people who would remember the day when their world, their perception of what was acceptable, had been forever changed. The silence in the bank was deafening. Every word that Marcus spoke seemed to cut through the stillness of the room, sharpening the tension that had already settled in the air. Ethan Caldwell, the regional manager, stood before him, trying to maintain an aura of control, but it was clear that his composure had shattered. The bank employees, who had been witnesses to the humiliation that had unfolded moments earlier, were now watching with wide eyes, aware that the situation was far from over. Marcus stood tall, unshaken. His gaze was steady, unwavering, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had seen the worst of the world and had risen above it. He didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. His words alone were enough. "You shouldn't need to know who I am to do your job correctly," Marcus said, his voice calm but cutting, each syllable deliberate. The words landed like a slap in the face of the entire room. He wasn't just speaking to Ethan. He was speaking to everyone who had ever dismissed someone like him, underestimated him, and assumed that wealth and success could only come in certain packages. Ethan, clearly taken aback by the sharpness of Marcus's statement, opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. His face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and panic. The weight of Marcus's gaze on him was unbearable. But before he could speak, the momentary paralysis lifted, and he turned to Todd, whose face was now pale with shame, his hands shaking. Todd opened his mouth to offer an excuse, but Marcus didn't give him the chance. He had seen enough. The time for apologies had passed. There was no point in pretending that this was a misunderstanding or an isolated incident. Marcus was done with words. He was ready for action. He wasn't interested in Todd's flimsy justifications, nor did he need to hear Ethan's hollow promises. What mattered now was ensuring that this would never happen again. "Todd," Marcus said, his voice crisp and authoritative, "you've shown an incredible lack of professionalism today. You've shown a lack of respect, and frankly, you've demonstrated that you're unfit to continue working in this bank." Todd flinched as if struck, his face flushed with shame. He stood there, paralyzed by the severity of the words, unable to respond. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked from Marcus to Ethan, as if hoping for some kind of intervention, some sort of rescue, but none came. Marcus didn't wait for any more excuses. His gaze didn't leave Todd's face. "You're done here." "Effective immediately," Marcus stated, his words final. Ethan, still visibly shaken, shifted uncomfortably. His gaze dropped to the floor, his shoulders slumping as the enormity of the situation settled in. He had been caught in the middle of something much bigger than he had anticipated. He had to act, and he had to act now. Without hesitation, Ethan turned to Todd, his voice stern. "Todd, I'm sorry, but you're being let go. You've not only violated the bank's protocols, but you've also made a serious error in judgment. This behavior will not be tolerated here." He hesitated for a moment, as if waiting for Todd to argue, but Todd remained silent. Ethan looked at him one last time, disappointment etched on his face before turning back to Marcus. "We'll escort you out," Ethan added, his voice now quieter, the finality of his words hanging in the air. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, watching as Todd's face drained of all color. Todd opened his mouth to speak, but his words faltered. The humiliation was overwhelming, and he knew that nothing could undo the damage he had caused. As he stood there, frozen in disbelief, the realization that he had just lost his job began to sink in. The employees standing behind the counter remained motionless, their eyes wide with shock. The customers who had been in line just moments before now watched the unfolding scene with a mix of confusion and awe. They had never seen anything like this in their lives. It was rare for such an event to unfold in public, and it felt almost surreal. But Marcus Hayes had just made sure that everyone in the room knew that this would not be swept under the rug. Marcus, however, wasn't finished. He wasn't just concerned with Todd's dismissal. He was focused on the bigger picture. He knew that this moment couldn't end with Todd's firing. This was an opportunity to ensure that no one else would have to go through the same humiliation he had. His voice, steady and commanding, rang out across the room again. "Ethan," Marcus said, turning to face the regional manager, "I want a full review of the bank's service policies and ethical standards. I want every employee here to undergo sensitivity training, and I want you to look into this branch's entire approach to customer relations. We can't afford to allow this kind of discrimination to persist. Not on my watch." Ethan looked up at him, his face pale and resigned. He nodded quickly, his eyes flickering with a mix of gratitude and regret. "Of course, Mr. Hayes. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." "Good," Marcus said with finality. He wasn't interested in apologies or excuses anymore. He wanted action. He wanted change. "I expect regular reports from you on the progress of these changes. This isn't just about making sure Todd is dealt with. This is about ensuring that every customer who walks into this bank is treated with respect and dignity, regardless of who they are or what they look like. You're in charge of that, Ethan. Don't let me down." Ethan nodded again, his eyes filled with determination. He could see that Marcus was not one to make empty threats. He had made a powerful point today, and he was determined to follow through on it. "Understood, Mr. Hayes. I'll make it my top priority." Marcus turned and began to walk toward the exit. The tension in the room didn't dissipate immediately, but as he moved, the energy began to shift. The employees who had witnessed the scene were slowly starting to process what had just happened. Some exchanged glances, while others stood frozen, still in shock over the abruptness of the situation. But one thing was certain: this bank would never be the same again. The days of unchecked discrimination and ignorance were over. As Marcus stepped out of the bank, he could feel the weight of the moment settling over him. It wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been mistreated or overlooked, for everyone who had been judged based on their appearance rather than their character or accomplishments. He had sent a clear message, not just to Todd, but to the entire institution. Respect was non-negotiable. In the end, Marcus Hayes didn't just ensure that justice had been served for himself. He made sure that no one else would ever have to fight the same battle he had fought today. And in that small act of defiance, he had brought about a change that would ripple through the bank, affecting not just the employees but every customer who walked through those doors in the future. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for anyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or judged unfairly. The battle for dignity had just begun, and Marcus had already won. Marcus Hayes walked out of the bank with his head held high, the weight of the moment settling over him. It wasn't anger that filled him now, but something deeper: clarity. Clarity about the world he lived in, and about the constant barriers he would always have to face, no matter how successful he became. It wasn't new. He had fought these battles his entire life. But today, something had changed. Today, he had done more than just stand up for himself. He had forced a change, made sure that things would be different in the future. As he walked toward the doors, he could feel the eyes of the employees and customers still on him. Some were watching with admiration, others in disbelief, but Marcus didn't need their validation. The action had been taken. The damage had been addressed, and consequences had been served. What mattered now was that the message had been sent. He stepped into the cool air outside, feeling the rush of freedom that came with taking control, but he knew that the fight wasn't over. He knew that no matter where he went, or how many doors he opened, there would always be those who looked at him and saw only his skin, only his appearance, and not his accomplishments or his character. It was a reality he had long accepted. But he had also learned that it was possible to change the narrative, to stand up and demand what was right. As he crossed the street, he paused for a moment, the sounds of the city swirling around him. The wind rustled through the trees, and the faint hum of traffic filled the air, but for Marcus, everything seemed momentarily still. He reflected on what had just transpired. The sense of injustice had been palpable. What Todd had done was not just an error. It was a manifestation of a much larger problem, a reflection of the way society often treated people who didn't fit a certain mold. But today, Marcus had refused to let that be his story. He had stood up. He had used his voice, his authority, to make sure that the same would never happen again. Before he left the bank, he had made sure to deliver his final words to Ethan and the remaining employees. He wasn't just speaking for himself, but for anyone who had ever been disrespected or judged based on their appearance, their skin, their background. He wanted to make it clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something much deeper, something that needed to be addressed, not just by him, but by everyone in the room. As he turned toward Ethan, who had been standing there, still shaken by the events, Marcus spoke with conviction. "Next time," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a promise, "when someone else walks in here, they won't be treated like I was today." The room had fallen silent when he spoke those words. Ethan nodded quickly, his face flushed with embarrassment, but he didn't try to justify or deny what had happened. There was no excuse for it. Marcus knew that Ethan had understood the significance of what he was saying. And though the manager had made an attempt to make amends, Marcus could see in his eyes that this moment had impacted him deeply. It wasn't just a lesson about customer service. It was a lesson about dignity, about equality, and about the power of standing up against injustice. Marcus's words weren't just for Ethan. They were for everyone in that room. The employees, the customers, anyone who had witnessed the humiliation he had endured. He wanted them to understand the true cost of discrimination, to know that no one should have to experience that feeling of being treated as less than, of being judged based on assumptions rather than on their true worth. He wanted them to understand that change was not just about policies or protocols. It was about the people who made up the system, the people who had the power to make a difference, to create an environment where respect was the standard, not the exception. As he left the building and stood on the sidewalk, his mind was already moving forward. The battle he had fought today wasn't just about that one instance. It was about the future. It was about making sure that the world was a little bit more just for the next person who walked through that door. For the next person who didn't fit the mold, who might be treated with suspicion or disdain, simply because of their appearance or their background. And it wasn't just about the bank either. It was about everyone who had ever experienced the sting of being overlooked, the pain of being misunderstood. It was about creating a world where dignity and respect were not optional, but the baseline. A world where the next generation wouldn't have to fight the same battles, where they wouldn't have to prove themselves just to be seen as equal. Marcus didn't look back as he walked down the street, his steps purposeful, his gaze forward. He had done what he set out to do today, but the fight wasn't over. It never would be. There would always be battles to fight, always more walls to tear down, but today he had made sure that one of those walls had crumbled. And as he walked through the busy streets of Manhattan, he felt a sense of calm, a sense of certainty that he was on the right path. This was about more than just one moment. It was about creating a ripple of change that would spread beyond the bank, beyond that single transaction. It was about starting a conversation, one that would hopefully inspire others to stand up, to speak out, to demand justice. He had done what he could today, but it wasn't just his responsibility. It was the responsibility of everyone who had witnessed it, who had seen the injustice, who had felt the discomfort in the room. It was their job, too, to make sure that the world didn't forget this lesson, that this wasn't just one man's fight, but a fight for all of us. As Marcus disappeared into the crowd, his heart light, he knew that the next time someone walked into that bank, someone who looked like him or someone who didn't fit the mold, they wouldn't have to face the same treatment. He had ensured that, and in doing so, he had given everyone who was watching a powerful reminder: speak up. Stand up. Don't remain silent in the face of injustice. Change only happens when we are brave enough to demand it.